Thank you so much, Kamala. And like you, I'm very excited to be a participant here today and part of this session. So without further ado, I'm going to just give a brief run through of Greta's bio. So Greta is currently a solution-focused leadership consultant and a certified corporate governance trainer who, over the past 20 years, has worked with both private and public sector entities in successfully developing directors' tools to support strategic board oversight and presenting results-oriented corporate governance programs. In 2001, Ms. Bogues spearheaded the establishment of the PSOJ Corporate Governance Committee, which continues to train directors and enhance awareness of the issues and principles of corporate governance best practices within Jamaica. And so therefore, you would understand how well poised she is to speak to us today about this session. Greta, I would like to turn it over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And welcome to everyone. And I must commend Kamala and her team on putting together this conference. From all indications, I was on for a short period yesterday, and I must say that you had some very spirited discussions. So I'm sure this has continued this morning. Unfortunately, I wasn't there, and I'm sure it will continue for the rest of the evening. But I think more importantly is that it will add value to the discussions on good governance within our region, because we have such a wide cross-section of presenters. So let me just share my screen with you, if I can. Is everybody seeing it? Are you seeing my screen?
Yes, thank you.
Wonderful. Let me just make sure now that better.
Yes, that's quite
all good. Right. So what I'm going to share with you over the next 20 minutes is really the future of role of legislation, really in framing corporate governance. And what I'm really going to talk to you about is Jamaica's experience, because I think as a small developing country, there's a lot that we've had to learn, and I do believe some of the lessons learned can help and add value to other countries in the region and even small developing countries outside of Jamaica. So there are four areas that I'm going to be looking at. First of all, who have been the players in our market? Who are really been in the corporate governance market in Jamaica? So we're going to talk a little about who those people are. And what was really our tipping point in Jamaica for corporate governance? Why did we now start to see this as something that, hey, we've got to do this? And then what is it that we have done, right? So what do we have in place? And of course, to share with you some lessons learned that we think can add value going forward. So within the context of Jamaica, and Jamaica is the third largest island in the region, we have, of course, our public sector and we have our private sector. So our private sector, really, of course, within the governance structure has its shareholders, it has its board, management, and employees. And what you're going to find in our private sector is that we have governing boards in the private sector, and those entities are normally registered under the Companies Act. We also have a number of listed companies who are also registered under the Companies Act, and they have governing boards also. And then we have a number of regulated entities who are not just under the Companies Act, but of course they're regulated, whether it be through our Financial Services Commission or through the Bank of Jamaica, being financial institutions. And of course, most importantly, when we talk about governance, you have stakeholders. On the public sector side, not much difference in that at the top of it, we have our responsible minister. So that's the minister who is responsible for a particular ministry. And they're the ones who make a recommendation to cabinet to appoint boards. And the board then appoints management, and then management, of course, appoints employees. So within the context of Jamaica, we have over 162 public bodies. That's a very large number. Might I tell you, it's coming from 190. So there's a lot of work that we've been doing to see, well, how do we consolidate some of these public bodies? So we have the public bodies, and some of them actually have what we call establishing statutes, right? And some of them are government companies. So they are actually set up under the Companies Act also. And then we have also what we call executive agencies, and they don't have governing boards. They actually have advisory boards. And as we know, advisory boards, these are boards now that provide advice to the CEO. And like the private sector, they also have stakeholders, the people of Jamaica, that hold them accountable. So that's what our framework is. We have both public sector and private sector entities that we're looking at. But you know, a lot has happened in Jamaica. And just to give you an idea, these are some of the headlines that we've seen in Jamaica over many years. And I'll just share with you the years of some of these extracts. So if you look from 1958, we've been having corruption. I won't tell you if that's before I was born. And we continue, 1984. We continue to 2001, 2017. It's just been consistent. Every other day, there are headlines of corruption taking place. And there comes a time when we really, as a people, have had to say, can we take this on anymore? How did we really get to this situation? And what are we going to do? Because there has to be a time where we have to make changes. So corruption drove us to this tipping point. And that really started in the 1990s. And I like to say it's a puzzle, and the puzzle is still incomplete. We're only just still putting together pieces. So, for example, in 1990, we had a massive financial crisis in Jamaica, which impacted very negatively on our financial institutions. Emanating from that, we had a number of legislations. We also saw high levels of public sector corruption. We had something called the Fat Cat scandal, where the amounts that CEOs were being paid by boards who were not accountable to anyone, created a great uproar in our country. And it was those activities, it was that actually drove us to a point to say, no, something has to happen here. So, of course, I am sure many of you know that when things significant as these happen in our country, our governments like to say, let's establish a committee. No different in Jamaica. We did a committee. So we actually formed a committee called the Thorburn Committee, and that was because it was led by Mr. Thorburn. So 1990 was really a turmoil year for us, driven a lot by the financial crisis, and just on the private sector side, but also on the public sector side, high levels of corruption. So what did this Thorburn Committee find? And they were looking at the public sector in particular. And what they really found is that there was just no clear understanding of roles and relationships of boards with their ministry, and of course, the Ministry of Finance. So people became directors, and they didn't have a clue as to what it is they were supposed to be doing. The other thing we found is that changes in boards took place once you had a change in a government. So if we had an election, the entire board resigned. So you can imagine in the private sector that we have a change in shareholdership and the entire board resigns. So there's no continuity at all. And the other thing, which was so important, was the fact that people who are being appointed to boards, there was no competency or no rhyme or reason as to how they even got onto the board. And when they got on there, the maintenance of poor financial records was very, very prevalent. So these were some of the findings that were in the Thorburn Committee. And what we found is that that committee said, you know, from a public body perspective, here is what we need to do. We actually need to have one overarching legislation that will govern the operations of public bodies. And that is what led us in 2000 to actually establish what we call the Public Bodies Management and Accountability Act, which is the only piece of legislation like itself in the region, right? So the government accepted the Thorburn recommendation and developed the Public Bodies Management and Accountability Act, which actually came into being in 2001. So from the private sector perspective, in 2001, we also introduced our new Companies Act, which actually spoke in much more detail to the fiduciary responsibilities of directors. Because one of the things that we found in our financial crisis, and a part of the research that I had done also, was that the majority of entities that failed in our financial institutions were indigenous financial institutions. So what we found is that places or banks like CIBC, Bank of Nova Scotia, while they had challenges in the period, they surely did not fail like all the indigenous institutions. And when we looked within the context of the institutions, while there were some external factors that contributed to that in terms of high interest rate, etc., one thing that we found that was consistent with our indigenous institutions is that the same person who had the majority shares was also the chairman of the board, was also the CEO. So if we go back and we look at what we know as governance specialists, that they control the three levels of governance or power within the organization. And that was actually quite significant, because that's what we found with all the indigenous institutions that actually failed in the financial crisis. So we came up with the new Companies Act. We had a new Financial Services Act, which now started to regulate financial institutions that weren't listed. Then we also had a new Banking Services Act also, because it was the financial institutions that were really significantly impacted. Because what you found again was that a lot of these institutions, they were banks, but they also owned insurance companies. They went into agriculture, they went into real estate, they went into everything. And there was no proper legislation in place to guide them. Then we also found that the central bank introduced what we call corporate governance best standards. So for all financial institutions, they actually had to abide by these best practices. Then the PSOJ in 2001, with all that was happening, we as the major and the premier advocacy organization in Jamaica, we thought that it was important, first of all, to establish a corporate governance committee. But the most important thing for us actually was to develop a corporate governance code, which is something that we did and actually rolled it out in 2006, because it did take some time for it to happen. But what is important to note is that that type of code is really a comply or explain. The PSOJ is not a regulatory body. That's not our interest. What we wanted to do was to provide guidelines for private sector entities to be able to establish good corporate governance practices. And then the other thing that happened in the 2000s was the establishment of a regional corporate governance code. I can tell you, Patrick McDonald and myself were the two Jamaican representatives. We did many trips in the region. We had people from Trinidad, St. Lucia, entire region, Guyana, everybody. We traveled many times to St. Kitts and to Antigua, where we had numerous meetings. And we finalized a regional corporate governance code that would have some basic principles to really help to get the entire region now on a governance footing. And might I say, it was signed off and handed over to CARICOM, and handed over to CARICOM, and handed over to CARICOM, and it's still sitting in CARICOM. Nothing has happened with it. So I want to share with you a little about this Public Bodies Management and Accountability Act, because it's not something that many people are very familiar with, because it doesn't exist anywhere else in the region. So what this act actually does is really the authority now for public bodies. Because of the challenges that we saw, we established this act now, which would provide the governance framework for all public bodies. Every public body had to operate like this. So it would bring consistency and harmony into their operations, greater compliance, right, with government policy, and of course, improve and enhance the public body's performance. Now, the legal requirements under the Public Bodies Management and Accountability Act, and it's the only piece of legislation we have in Jamaica where Section 6.1 speaks to only corporate governance. So not even the Companies Act has it as structured as this. And it actually states clearly what every board must have and the steps that they must take to ensure the efficient and effective management of the public body. It talks about ensuring that there are effective controls that are set up, that there are measurable objectives and targets that have been established, and that the responsible minister is aware of policy, germane policy, so not policy where he is supposed to come and do anything operational, but we are supposed to at least advise the minister, and he will share with the board the top line policy of the government, which is what will guide the public body. The important thing to note about this piece of legislation, which we can always find online, is that it actually has sanctions. So Section 25 says that if you breach not having in place your corporate governance practices, not having in place a proper audit committee, not attending board meetings, because it speaks to that also, that if you don't attend 3 consecutive board meetings, then we can say that you're no longer on the board. There are sanctions in place, right? And people could be fined up to $1 million, Jamaican dollars. So I want you to keep that in mind. So we have this strong piece of legislation for public bodies that actually includes sanctions. On the private sector side, as I said, we have a code, and we consider that to be kind of our soft law, because that code, it goes through and it has 8 different principles, and it does give you what your principles are, your supporting principles and your guidelines. Again, it's not legislative. We have tried to encourage our members as private sector members to participate and to be up and utilize it. And what I will say is that the Jamaica Stock Exchange has actually taken it on board and said that listed companies should use the PSOJ Corporate Governance Code as guidance in implementing their corporate governance practices. The corporate governance framework for public bodies is the next thing that we're going to talk about, because that's the next piece of the puzzle. Because the 2001 Public Bodies Management and Accountability Act, people complained. We didn't understand aspects of the legislation. How do you implement these things? How do we monitor these things? So what we decided in Jamaica is that, okay, so we will now develop a corporate governance public bodies framework, which will complement how people will react or respond to the Public Bodies Management and Accountability Act. So it's really a tool that details what they need to do and how, not the what is in the legislation, the framework is really telling you the how. So the third piece of that puzzle in the 2010 now was the development of this corporate governance framework for public bodies. The other thing that we looked at was a competency profile, because again, it's so important to ensure that you get the right person on the board. And yesterday I was in the session that spoke to the issues of induction and orientation. And if you don't have the right person on the board, the induction and orientation won't add the type of value that you really, really want. So it really starts at getting the right person on the board. Also now on the private sector side, for the Jamaica Stock Exchange in 2010, they introduced a corporate governance rule for the first time, and they have been operating since 1968. So Rule 414 was introduced, and all listed companies, whether you're on the main market or the junior market now, have to abide, or should, I should say, abide by those rules. And those rules they were taken out of the New York Stock Exchange, but they're very much in line also with the PSOJ Corporate Governance Code. In 2016, we also updated our Corporate Governance Code. And in 2018, the Stock Exchange introduced the Corporate Governance Index. So the Corporate Governance Framework document, which is a companion document for the public bodies management and accountability, it actually is set up like a code. It has 20 principles, right? And it gives details as to what is the role of the board, what is the role of the chairman, how board invitees should be treated, what board diversity is all about, board selection and appointment, what's the role of the auditor, ensuring that we have ERM in place, developing a code of ethics for your board. It's detailed. It's a detailed document, and you can actually find it on the Ministry of Finance website. So this is now the tool that complements the Public Bodies Act. So at this stage, you would expect that, okay, 2012, 11 years later, we now have this document. So this is what is now required for all public bodies board to operate effectively. The competency profile, that came a little later on, and this was in relation to Corporate Governance Framework Principle 8. And what it did is that after lots of consultation, 2 years of consultation with private, public sector, opposition, members of parliament, everybody, we came up with this competency profile. And what we did is that we divided all the ministries into their various agencies. And then we looked at generic competencies that every board should have. So for example, there is a requirement in the Public Bodies Act that every board must have an audit committee, and the person who chairs that committee must have accounting information. So we know that having someone with professional accounting information is a criteria to sit on the board. So every board normally has a lawyer, they have an accountant on there. And then what we did is we looked at every public body and said, what are the competencies required for this public body? So no longer should ministers now be just appointing my friend who contributed the most money, or here is the profile of the competencies that are required for the board. And that complements our gender policy that also stated that every public body board should have a minimum of 30% of females on the board. So we brought down the competency profile, and again, this document is on the minister's website, and it provides for the competencies for directors, the competencies that's required when you're choosing a chairman, and also the technical competency required for each public body. On the private sector side, recognizing where we are as a developing country in Jamaica and what was required for us for growth, we thought, again, from the PSOJ, it's now important for us to have a corporate governance code for MSMEs. And so in 2016, we also developed a code for MSME, taking into consideration family-owned businesses. Because what we find in Jamaica, and I think dare say throughout the region, there are a large number of family-owned businesses. And what we wanted to do was to kind of encourage persons, when you start your business, start with putting good governance in place. So that when you get to the stage that you want to list in the junior market or you want to list on the stock exchange and main market, you always would have at least developed some of those governance practices that will help to guide you through your development as a company. So we actually developed this code in 2016. And I might say that what we're doing right now is developing or enhancing our code. And what we're doing is bringing together our main code and our MSME code and actually adding another feature, which is for charitable organizations and also for family-owned businesses. So what we're doing is having a comprehensive corporate governance code for Jamaica, which we hope to finalize. We've finalized the first draft already, but it should be in place for 2021. Another interesting thing that happened from the private sector perspective was the introduction of our corporate governance index. As I had indicated earlier, in 2010, the Jamaica Stock Exchange actually introduced a corporate governance rule 414, which was broken down into 3 categories in line with what our corporate governance code was. But notwithstanding that, many of us would actually look at annual reports and wonder about the governance still. So one of the things that we've always had to try and do without doing it legislatively is to see what type of soft law, again, can you put in to help to enhance corporate governance within listed companies. And the stock exchange, in their own wisdom, in collaboration with us at the PSOJ, we all work together to develop a corporate governance index. And that corporate governance index came into place 3 years ago. And I actually chaired a review committee for that index. Now, with that corporate governance index, once you're listed on the Jamaican Stock Exchange for at least 1 year, you are going to be assessed. So you are assessed based on the governance information that you have provided to the stock exchange and publicly. And once we assess you, you are actually given a rating, and there is a rating criteria for each area, and that rating is sent to the company for them to review, and they may appeal it, and then it's published. So the stock exchange is now working to ensure that they can publish every company, and they're looking at amending their rules to do that. Currently, they now have to get approval from companies to publish their corporate governance index. But what I will say to you, having chaired that review committee for the past 3 years, without actually putting a legislation in place, we have started to change the behavior of companies listed on the stock exchange by putting in better corporate governance practices. And we have seen where those scores have increased tremendously. And as a matter of fact, the Corporate Governance Best Practice Award is a very premium award that now many listed companies are working towards. I should also have mentioned that that is another thing we did on the private sector side. So on the public sector side, so having implemented the 2001 Corporate Public Bodies Management and Accountability Act, then introduced the Corporate Governance Framework in 2012, in 2016 we said, hey, we now need to take another step. And you notice we have to take these steps slowly, right? We can't just put everything in place. And we introduced the Public Bodies Corporate Governance Awards. And might I tell you, that has also started to change behavior on public bodies. Because again, people are now being recognized by the peers, because this is something done by the PSOJ in conjunction with the Ministry of Finance. And we make a big spread out of it. It's a big spread. And, you know, this year with COVID, we got so many calls. We're not having the awards. So again, there are different ways that you can change behaviors. And sometimes it's not just all legislation. The other thing we did on the private sector side, and this is more in terms of the regulators, they also introduced the best practices regulating the financial institutions. So whether they're listed or not, there are certain corporate governance best practices that they all have to adhere to. So what I would say to you is that in Jamaica, we have been looking at both soft law and hard law, right? And those things highlighted in red are what I would call soft law, and then those in black are actual legislations and legislations that have enforcement behind it. So we had to make choices in Jamaica. We had to decide to go the easy way, leave them as they are, or we're going to go the hard way. And the hard way is putting in the legislation. The easier way is, do we do regulations or more codes and more guidelines? What is it that we need to do in order to get the buy-in? Because what we're really trying to do is to change behaviors and to hold people accountable, something that we were never doing before. So there were some serious drivers of change for us. And one of them, of course, was the people. Jamaicans. We had gotten to this stage where there was this erosion of trust. Erosion of trust, and it still exists, but not at the level that it was before. We did not believe in what was happening within our public bodies, and even within the context of even some of our private entities, some of our listed companies, we didn't have enough information on. So there was this erosion of trust that was getting to a point that we said, guess what? We need to have good governance in place. And that is driven a lot also because of availability of information in this digital age. Anything I want to know, I mean, I just looked at something on the South African corporate governance code. I mean, anything I want to know. In 1990, when I started to do work on corporate governance, and I remember I needed the King report, it had to be dropped in a box and then it was sent. I don't need to do that anymore. At 2, 3 in the night, if I want morning, I want to look at it, I can find it. So the whole looking at information, the availability of easy information now, it has really made us start to think differently. And most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, the rules of engagement, it's changing. It's changing not just locally, but it's changing globally. Jamaica is no longer just a little country here where we trade among ourselves. We are a part of this global environment, and people outside of our country are demanding greater accountability. So we have to put in place strategies to respond to that if we effectively want to be a part of the global party. So one of the things that we did from the public sector side is that we actually established in 2014 a public-private sector partnership. And that public-private sector partnership emanated with us having what we call a corporate governance implementation oversight committee. And that was driven by the PSOJ along with the Ministry of Public Service, Finance and Public Service. And what we did was that we took that same framework document and said, hey, because people still complain that they didn't have templates how to do these things, you know. So although you have the details, we said, all right, we're going to work with you. We're going to develop the templates, etc. And this grouping is a volunteer grouping, and we still meet and we're still doing work from the public sector perspective. One of the things that we did, which we think is a great game changer for us on the public sector side, it's required already on the private sector for listed company, is develop a board evaluation for public sector boards. So we actually did this in 2017, and we did a pilot, And in July 2020, it was actually signed off officially by Cabinet, so that every public body now has to do a board evaluation, and that those results must be discussed with the portfolio minister. And the evaluation is actually broken down into 3 areas. You look at the overall board and its chairman. Then you look at your own individual assessment. And then, of course, each committee and the chairman are also assessed. We want to get to the stage, of course, to the peer evaluation. But as we said, we know it's a journey. So we have to take stages. So this has started to work. And what we're finding is that in the annual reports that are being developed by the public bodies, they're now talking about their board evaluations. One of the significant game changers that we have been working on from 2014 was to put in place a new set of guidelines to deal with the nomination, selection, and appointment of directors. Because I cannot overemphasize, if you don't start here, then everything else that we do adds no value. And I think all of us know as governance persons that you've got to have the right person on the board. And therefore, you need to take the time to make sure that you have the right person. So after 4 years, consultation again, we got the cabinet to approve in 2018 the new nomination, selection, and appointment of directors for public bodies. Believe me, it was a joyful time for us in Jamaica because everybody realized and recognized that's where the problem started, the appointment. Now, the then minister, who is still the current minister, he said, guess what? We are not going to do this as soft law. We want this as legislation. So we don't want any other party to come in and then our government to come in and you change it. So it's going to Parliament. We're going to develop regulations for it. So we said, great, yeah, we're part of that. So it took us a little while, but it was actually tabled and approved in our lower chambers in December 2019. Now, as many of you will know, based on our parliamentary system, you have to go to the lower house and you have to go to the upper house with the senators. And it went to the Senate in December 2019 and was withdrawn in March 20 because it wasn't debated. And we actually had an implementation date for February. So it was tabled again in July 2020 with changes. And from my next slide, I'm sure you can tell me what the changes were. But then we had national elections. And since we had elections, it's going to be tabled again, I'm told, before the end of the year. So while we have a cabinet approved policy, one would think that cabinet would therefore adhere to it. It's the same government, it's the same people in place. Well, we will see. So what does this particular regulation or guideline actually say? And the first thing it does is that it reduces how many boards people can sit on. Because we had situations where we have people sitting on 8, 9 boards and they have their full-time jobs. So we said, really? How do you do this if you're going to be adding value? Persons can only serve as a chairman of a maximum of 2 boards. Right? And they can only do that for 2 consecutive terms. Again, one of the important features we had is this wholesale resignation of directors whenever there was a change in minister. So even within the context of the same government, if you change a minister, and then of course, if you change political administration, every board member resigns. No, 1/3 of that board must be left behind. So this again forces persons to say, hey, we're now starting to look for competent people to sit on the board. And then we place directors' limits. So nobody can serve on a public sector board for more than 10 years. So who cannot sit on boards? No member of the Houses of Parliament can sit on boards. So if you're an MP, if you're a councillor, you can't sit on boards and senators. That's what the legislation says now. But might I tell you what exists is that senators chair boards, they sit on boards, councillors sit on boards, etc. This piece of legislation would be a game changer for them. So probably you can now understand why this legislation as a regulation is being held up. It's a big game changer, right? Very big game changer. And the process now for appointment would be, what we are doing in Jamaica is we're starting to develop a database. So if you want to sit on a public sector board, just apply. You can apply to sit on the board, and we will do the due diligence and you will be on the database. And then what we will do is ensure there's diversity also, but to look at the competency profile of the selected candidates. So when a minister says, hey, I need someone who is an engineer, I need someone with environmental experience, we go to the database and we provide them with names and they choose. So then the minister will make his or her recommendations and cabinet approve. So of course, many people say, well, the minister's cronies can still sit on there. And we say, well, guess what? If they are a Jamaican, if they are fit and proper, and if they have the competence in terms of knowledge, experience, all the other things, then that's a strong possibility. But however, they would now have gone through that process to give us as Jamaicans some comfort that why is it that Greta Bogues went on this board? What she bring to that board? Oh, she no minister. No. So what we're doing is establishing this database now, and that's the pool from where ministers will now choose directors. And to complement that, what we're doing also is ensuring that as directors are chosen, that we also do training for them so they understand what their responsibility is. So friends, that's a mouthful. We've done so much, and believe me, a lot of volunteer work. But guess what? In 2019, the IMF says to us, you need to address governance. And we have the legislation, we have regulations, we have codes. We still need to address governance. And it's not just them. These are the headlines in our papers. Corruption crisis. Petrojam saga deepens. Expect more corruption. Fraud. So we all have to say to ourselves, what else? Because it really starts with us. It starts with us as a people. So friends, I will say to you that there are some key lessons that we have learned in Jamaica as we continue this journey. And the first one is that as a small developing nation, right, you have to look at partnerships, because there's going to be a tipping point in your own country where you say enough is enough. Legislation is not going to be the only way to change behaviors. While it's a good starting point, we have found, based on our own experience, we have had to do other things to complement the legislation, right? So that's important, because the other thing we have found is that you have the legislation and there's no enforcement. So if we go back and talk about the Public Bodies Management and Accountability Act, I showed you section 25, which talks about enforcement, but if you're not enforcing it, why are we having the legislation anyhow? The other thing is that implementation has to be a priority, right? And when we had the Public Bodies Management and Accountability Act in 2001, it was law, but it wasn't really being implemented. So it's not being enforced, not being implemented, nobody is being held to account. The other thing is we also have to recognize the value added that you get from having good corporate governance practices in place. And I mean, the introduction in 2016 of the Corporate Governance Awards for the private sector and also in 2008 for the public-private, it was, sorry, let me do that again. 2007 for the private sector, the awards, and 2016 for the public sector awards. I can tell you, based on the research we've done, that was a significant turning point. When people started to see that they were going to be recognized publicly based on the work they have done in that area, it made a difference. And then for us, the most important thing really is that stakeholders have to play an active role. You can't play a passive role as a citizen in your country. You have to play an active role. We cannot sit on our verandas and talk about it. We have to hold our leaders accountable, whether they're in the private sector or they're in the public sector. You have invested your personal money for the private sector. In the public sector space, it's your tax-paying money. And civil society groups, surely in Jamaica, are becoming much louder, and they should, because they are the ones that will hold us accountable. So for us in Jamaica, it has to be all hands on deck. And I think all other countries in the region, you're going to find that this can't happen without partnership. It can't be the government alone. It can't be the private sector alone. In Jamaica, we have to say, we say one hand clap the other. So it's all hands on deck if we really want to see good corporate governance implemented. So for us, it's been a journey, and the journey continues because there's so much more to do. We still have not had the regulations implemented, and we are working to get that done using a lot of pressure from various advocacy groups. And I like to close with this particular quote from our Minister of Finance, who has really been a driving force in terms of pushing for that regulation for their nomination, selection, and appointment of directors in Jamaica. And he emanated from the private sector. And he has said that public bodies really do not belong to any individual. They do not belong to any minister. They do not belong to any government. They really belong to and exist to serve the people of Jamaica. And the more we understand that, the easier it will be for us to continue to implement good corporate governance practices for Jamaica. And I thank you very much for your time and for listening.
Well, Greta, we really do thank you. I think that was a very insightful presentation, and it really sets up the discussion for the future role of legislators in framing corporate governance. And I think one of the key takeaways is that it is not just the role of the legislator, right? Everybody has a role to play, the private sector, civil society, etc. And one of the things you said is that you highlighted the fact that what Jamaica is doing is possibly a role, a guidance position that you're taking in the region for the rest of the Caribbean. And so I would like to first invite the other Caribbean panelists, Ms. Elizabeth Cox, CEO of Casper Investments and chairman of RF&G Life, who straddles both Guyana and Belize, to bring in her perspective now on this, especially what Greta has outlined, and how do you think in Guyana and Belize and possibly the rest of the region, how close do you think we can come to having sort of structures in place?
All right, thank you, Camille. First of all, I'd like to thank Kamala and CCJ. I know Kamala has been pulling me along this journey for a while over the last couple of months. I have not been able to attend sessions in prior years because of my travel schedule. But this year I was able to attend quite a bit of sessions, and thank you, Kamala. I know that people call me the person of energy, but I think you were the energizer bunny. So thanks a lot. I also felt that, when I started off, you mentioned to me that they wanted me to be on the panel, and I think it was deliberate. You put me to the end of the day. It's like I had to be from yesterday to today. So, another trick by you and Christy. But when I read the bios of the speakers over the last couple of days, they're extremely distinguished and accomplished persons. I know Professor Bob Garrett. I mean, Professor, you are a walking encyclopedia on governance, and certainly you brought a breath of fresh air, a breath of experience that I think everybody is going away with something of benefit just listening to you, the whole thought process. So thank you for that. And certainly I'd like to thank Christy. Christy has always been moving us from one to the next transition very seamlessly. So Christy doing a good job as usual. Now, my own experience has been very mixed with corporate governance, and I've served on several boards, both private sector and public sector, and family owned and publicly owned boards. And I've seen this whole concept of corporate governance moving from ticking a box to just being totally ignored, ticking a box and putting it into the annual report because it really looks good for you as a company to potential investors. But I view it very seriously, and I think that what Jamaica has done, and Greta, excellent presentation. I mean, you're kind of like my girl on the block right now. And I wish that, and I'm glad you mentioned the fact that CARICOM, because that has always bothered me. Why it is that each state, whether it's banking legislation, whether it's insurance legislation, we each go off and we get a consultant that comes in, and we create something, cut and paste. I always say cut and paste, because we get information and we get stuff where it's totally unrelated to our culture, or the way we operate, the way we do business is totally different from the way it is done in a developed world. But yet we are tasked with reviewing regulations which doesn't apply to us. And it's always a pushback, and a constant pushback and a pullback. And then some companies tend to yield because of political influence as well. And that really upsets me a lot. I'm happy to know that at least CARICOM, that you have corporate governance, you have something regional, because that was one of the questions I had here. Jamaica has done so much work. Why can't we have that now built in as part of CARICOM? So I'm happy to hear that it actually rests with CARICOM. And I am actually going to raise it with our private sector to see how best we can use some of what you have done. Why reinvent the wheel? You've done a lot. And I mean, I know Guyana have a corporate governance in place, code and K in place, but do we have for the public sector? No. And the public sector, I mean, we've seen it. We've just had two changes. We had a change, and then we had another change 5 years later. And each change, the entire boards were removed and replaced. And I mean, that to me is counterproductive. It's counterproductive because where is the institutional knowledge going? Through the door. We start back from scratch, we put persons in place. And so that is why public entities that are semi-autonomous can't really grow, I would say, because we don't have this proper seamless transition in terms of institutional knowledge from one to the next. And I know that I've told Kamala this. I've sat on a state board, a utility board. First of all, when the minister called us, like, is this a political appointment? Because if it is, I'm not interested. But he said, no, they're looking for somebody from the private sector, and your name came up from the private sector, and that's what we're doing. But you know what I learned? I was excited because I'm like, this is a great opportunity for me to give back to my country. I'm happy to do this. It wasn't about the board fees. It was just about my interest in giving back to the country. But what I realized after a while, after about 10 years, because, you go and we have strat planning, and we, all this dossier of information is done, it is put away, and very few things are actually implemented. Very few things are actually implemented. And I mean, I got disgusted after a while, and I thought to myself, this is not where I want to be. I mean, I've spent a lot of hours at board meetings every single month, and it really, to me, did not translate into any particular action. And I think that if we can separate, or probably have something like Jamaica has, where you have accountability in that act and legislation that you have, so it's independent of the government. It's not the government comes in and you select your friends or whoever, and you have people serving on multiple boards as well. And it is really disgusting and disheartening, because They go on campaigns, they promise all kinds of things, and then they come back and do the same thing like the previous administration. But that's for another discussion. Now, in terms of regulation, I think, and I'm speaking now here from an insurance background, we're overregulated now. Overregulated now. We move from one extreme to the next. Why this happened? Because of CLICO and some other companies, insurance companies that collapsed. We move from one extreme to the next. I mean, when I look at the Trinidad Insurance Act, it's draconian. It is draconian. It has not even been, it has been accented to, but it has not been passed to be implemented as yet. And this is years, I'm telling you. And this is the central bank trying to regulate the insurance industry. But being overregulated, I mean, terribly overregulated. When it comes to the AML, I know yesterday we discussed that issue about the AML and what we are required to do as a small island state or a small country state is ridiculous. It has really, for instance, even in Belize, it has cost us a lot of money and a lot of times counterproductive to business because of what is required to just sell a simple insurance policy, a life insurance policy. What is required is ridiculous. And to me, it is counterproductive. And I'm not certain how we can change that because this is not required in the developed world. Why is those things imposed on us? And the regulators really just take it on. The government has said, well, we have to do this because our country will be blacklisted. So we have to do it. And so that's imposed on us. But, as we discussed yesterday, we have to collectively push back. We have to collectively push back for change. Now, what you mentioned today about the Public Bodies Management Accountability Act, you said that was implemented in 2001, but you still have corruption. I mean, so it seems like even if we have regulation, if it is not enforced,
absolutely, yeah,
it makes no sense because Guyana is filled with that, and Belize, we love to pass legislation. Everything we pass a legislation on, but when it's enforced is another question. And so I leave my comments there. I could make some more comments later, but I can stop here. Thank you. Great presentation. I quite enjoyed all the stuff that you had to share.
Well, thank you so much, Liz, for offering that Caribbean perspective. I would now like to turn to Richard Foster. Richard is still there. I can't see him in the thumbnail, so I'm not sure if he fell off.
No,
Richard, you're here.
I'm here.
Okay, you're good. Thank you so much.
It is night time, but at the moment we do have lights. Okay, not guaranteed, but...
Okay, and so Richard is a member of the King Committee on Corporate Governance in South Africa, and I thought that it was very interesting what Greta was pointing to, the way in which they were also using the stock exchange in Jamaica to be able to, as she put it, implement soft law in order to get the change they needed in terms of good governance achieved. And I was wondering if you could bring in now your perspective, speak for about 5 minutes or so on your experiences, etc., and how that can tie into what you were doing and what the King Committee is doing with what we're seeing in Jamaica.
Okay, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. And I mean, it's so interesting for me to listen to perspectives, say from Jamaica and elsewhere. And in some ways, they're very similar to certainly what have prevailed within other developing economies, such as ours, elsewhere in Africa. But perhaps I can just share, some of the South African or King journey with you. And King's always been very progressive in terms of, one needs to rather go that principle-based approach. That has been from the beginning, a stakeholder inclusive approach, not the rule-based approach. And as I say, we've probably been ahead of the curve in that regard. that doesn't come without its challenges. And also, the King reports have been fairly aspirational in terms of haven't been focused only on, say, listed companies. One has tried to have a very, very broad cover of all entities. And I think the difficulty has been that if you have a look at the various iterations of King, and we're now at King 4, somewhat 28 years later, the listed companies have generally, well, the stock exchange says you've had to apply King. So they've very much fallen into place, sometimes with respect, kicking and screaming on certain things, but more on a compliance tick box approach. Some of the other sectors, well, there's no real enforcement. Public sector, although it's aspirational that King should be applied, it doesn't seem to align. It's too difficult. Some of the terminology doesn't really gel with what we've got in the public sector. So there's been a bit of a resistance. So we've gone through this over a number of years. And I think one of the big shifts in King 4 was to have a look and say, well, let's have a generic report. Let's distill the principles down to 16 principles with an additional one if you're an institutional investor. And what King then did is create some sector supplements and said, well, you know what, here's the generic report. It talks about governing bodies, not boards, so you can't confuse terminology. And in some of the municipal entities, we have councillors, not board members. We don't quite understand. We've used generic terminology throughout. We refer to organizations rather than companies. And then what we've attempted to do is define 5 key sectors, such as state-owned enterprises, not-for-profit organizations, municipal entities, retirement funds, and interesting in Jamaica as well, SMEs, because they're such an important driver for economic growth within, but particularly a developing economy. So those sector supplements cover off the same principles, but they highlight some of the issues that you might face, particularly in the public sector. But the principles are generic. It's as easy to apply those 16 principles in a sporting body, in a state-owned entity, as in an international listed conglomerate. The difference is in the practices you actually put in. Also, King was quite specific that some of the pushback had been, well, we found the previous reports too overwhelming, particularly for the smaller companies. We can't have audit committees. We can't have various other committees. And King has made it quite explicit, you know what, you take these principles, but it's up to the directors or the governing body members to decide what governance they need in their organization. Obviously, then one balances this with the legislation or regulations that are in place for a particular sector. Banking, financial services, I mean, it's an industry that I come from. I'm still involved there in a non-executive capacity. And I've just heard the previous speaker say, well, we're over-regulated. Surprise, surprise. We've headed it that way as well. And I think it's been a natural reaction to sort of global financial crisis a while back, and generally the failure of companies. And there's still a view out there that one can legislate to create the right behavior. So I guess where I'm getting to, King has always been of the view that one needs to create this balance or harmony between your legislation, your regulations, and the codes that are in place, how you actually do things. But a couple of things, if I can just pick up in the conversations that, are an absolute common thread. It's really about getting the right people in the boardroom, whether it's in the public sector, and we've been through tremendous difficulty in that regard. And if you've been following the press in this country, we've had serious issues with so-called state capture, where the major state-owned entities have been captured by certain individuals and the money has disappeared. So these are the type of things that, you know, we've been dealing with, and a lot depends on the shareholder, as we call them, the executive authority, the nomination process. These are all things that you've been covered, so that you've covered. And excuse me, so what I'm saying is, you know, there's a common thread to all of this. It's just how do you, you know, how do you get this rectified in the private sector? The institutional investors need to play a bigger role. If I can just comment there, South Africa also has the CRISA code, the Code for Responsible Investing. In fact, the second draft of the new CRISA code has just gone out for public comment or consultation. Might be worth having a look at. So we've also recognized private sector, the institutional shareholders have a huge role to play, particularly around ESG. I heard quite a lot about, you know, the corporate governance indexes. South Africa, same thing. In our stock exchange, we have ESG index now rather than the CSI index. So shareholders are expected to play a far more proactive, responsible role in driving good governance within organizations. And as I say, now extending particularly into environmental and social issues. So that comes, you know, it's a double-edged sword. Well, how do you change that behavior? Do you then put in more legislation or regulations for the institutional investors? And at this stage, it's been very much that we've had a investor code. It's on and it has been on a apply or explain basis. It will now be on an apply and explain basis. In other words, a qualitative report. But what we found in the latest discussions, as I say, the draft's only just been released. So there've been some very, very recent, you know, stakeholder engagements and discussions around the code, and a number of key stakeholders have raised the aspect: how are you actually going to get this enforced? And that's why I say it's a double-edged sword. You go ahead with principle-based approach, but at the end of the day, sometimes one needs to actually find a way to ensure that people actually do apply the code. So, you know, on a broad context, that's pretty much been the story in South Africa. The other thing which might be of interest to you is the link between our legislation and the governance codes. And while King has been self-regulatory, what we found over since 2007 was the first reported case where a judge of the High Court, in order to clarify the behavior of the directors, in other words, did you act with due care, skill, and diligence? He looked to the governance code at that stage. It was King 2, and looked at what was expected in terms of best practice. Since that particular case, it related to a mining company. There have been 6 other reported cases. And the reason I mention it, most recently in the last 2 months, the ex-chairman of the South African Airways company, again, state-owned entity, she was declared a delinquent director. But to me was quite important, within the judgment, there were 6 references by the judge to the latest King report, and also the practice note for King relating to the requirements for a chairman and duties of a chairman, or recommendations in respect of what a chairman of a company should do. And it was quite interesting, you know, in terms of the cross-examination. Well, as a director, did you act with due care and skill? You're required to do that in terms of law. And then, did you do this or did you do that? Were you even aware of what was in the King report? I mean, you were the chair of a significant organization. This isn't, as I say, this is now the sixth reported judgment, and the courts are moving further and further in that direction. And it's not just within the listed space. We've seen it in the public sector space, where again the CEO was the same sort of case where he was being declared a delinquent director. And again, the judge said, are you aware of the King report? Just on the lighter side, King who? We don't have one. And the judge says, I'm talking about our governance report. But again, the very strong link was made. You as that individual should at least be aware of what is in the code, and then further, in terms of your position, drive that those principles through the organization, or ensure that they're driven through the organization. So as I said, that's the way we've sort of headed in this country. But again, I mean, it's a mixture of, as I say, legislation, regulation, and then the principles. But I think the big shift for King is trying to get people, and I heard it mentioned earlier, to accept governance as a value-added driver rather than grudge compliance or tick box exercise. And I think that's going to be a global challenge. That the traditional view, unfortunately, of corporate governance to a large extent, and still in major, really big boardrooms, is, well, do we comply? Not have we applied, and what is our journey going forward? It's what is our compliance to date? Have we complied with whatever legislation or whatever report? And to get boards to understand that this is a journey, it's about self-improvement, it's about embracing changes going forward, I think is a challenging job. And just to end off, when I talk about a challenging job, the other thing is I think one of the biggest challenges for us is to try and suitably upskill the directors and the members of the various board committees. Audit committees, probably more mature than others. We have what's known now as social and ethics committees, focusing on corporate citizenship, stakeholder relationships, ethical behavior. Those committees have these generalizations, my own opinion, have a long way to go in comparison to, say, the audit committee. And the remuneration committees also, I think, have become a lot more important. But again, to tie the remuneration committee to the strategy of the company and get those committee members to fully understand the link between the remuneration and the strategy, on a sort of triple context basis, and tie that together is still a journey, particularly in this country. So I think I'll end there. And I mean, if there are questions, I'm obviously happy to take them. But hopefully that just gives you some sort of flavor to where we've been in South Africa in the recent past.
Yes, thank you so much, Richard. And so now I would like to introduce John into the conversation. Now, John is not only a corporate director, but he's also a retired technology leader. And one of the interesting things that Greta brought out was the nexus between people and technology, and where the groundswell for change was driven by technology increasing transparency. And so I wanted to now invite you to offer your perspective on how, the role technology plays in corporate governance. And I would also like to encourage participants to please enter any questions they may have into the chat so that we can also raise that with the committee. Thank you. Sorry, the panel.
Yeah, so thanks, Carmel, for introducing me. Yes, if you look at my bio, I am primarily a technology person. Meaning that I spent the vast majority of my career in technology companies, just retiring from Microsoft about 8 years ago and then moving into the government space. One thing I do, to answer your question particularly, I mean, technology is an enabler of people. And, what was said a few minutes ago, that technology will increase access to information and also increase, and therefore there's going to be incredible need for transparency of companies, because information is available today, and I think it can only be expected that information will become even more available in the future. And so companies need to be transparent in their practices and become even more transparent in their practices in the future is really the way to expect things to happen. It's been a great conference for me to attend. Thank you so much for inviting me. I've learned quite a bit, and I just want to kind of add a U.S. perspective on a lot of these issues. First, regarding this panel, we're talking about public sector organizations. And as you probably know, in the U.S., we have very few public sector organizations. We do not have a Singapore Airlines. We do not have a Trinidad Airlines. We unlikely will have those kinds of entities in the future. I guess I want to kind of answer the why. I think why that is the case. If you look at the public polling about where do people have confidence and belief in organizations, if you poll the U.S. public, there is very low confidence in CEOs in the U.S. and also in American businesses, so that they are rated low. And in the U.S., one of the organizations which is lower than CEOs and businesses actually is the U.S. federal government. So there is a very, very low belief or confidence in the U.S. government, U.S. federal government. And obviously, in this past year, where the U.S. has been faced with COVID, which is among the highest rates in the world, the COVID crisis, and in the U.S., we had what we call the George Floyd killing, which is basically the killing and murder of a Black man who, it's basically believed was a very unjust killing. And that and there was so even with very low confidence in businesses and lower confidence in the federal government, there was a really big outcry from most people that American businesses had to do something. And so there really was a big response from American businesses about George Floyd, about different ESG issues. Diversity on boards and in organizations has been a very big topic in the U.S. Again, we have a very different ecosystem than the other countries that are participating in this conference today. So we do have, we do have a small and limited public sector, and I just really want to emphasize that in the U.S., we have public companies, which means that we have publicly owned companies with shares that are on the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ. So we consider them public companies, not public sector companies. And those public companies are really owned. Most of it is owned. Most public companies are owned by a handful of companies. So that's why you hear about BlackRock and you hear about State Street and you hear about large pension funds. The California State Teachers Association, for example, pension fund is a large shareholder. It is really the investors who have the most power within the U.S. and for U.S. businesses. And so, again, relative to regulation that comes from the federal government, the SECs and other regulations, SEC is the U.S. Stock and Exchange Commission, Securities and Exchange Commission. It's really what investors want is really where U.S. businesses really focus on. So as the BlackRocks and State Streets talk about needing to have diversity on boards, businesses listen. As those big investors talk about need for focus on environment, that's where business focus on. And so the drivers of what's happening within businesses, I will say, primarily come from the investors. And then obviously there are regulations that happen from the US federal government. But I will say in broad generalities, a lot of that regulation has been coming from businesses. So it takes many, many years for there to be regulations in the US. And so the business community kind of come together for different beliefs about what regulation should be. It may take 5 years before a regulation actually is implemented within the US government. And that's when businesses have to comply. So the bigger, more powerful institutions are the investors, and then the secondary is the federal government. Much more I can say about lots of different topics that we've talked about over the past couple of days, but I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, John, for that perspective, that extra regional perspective, as well as Robert before you. Richard before you. So I just wanted to circle back now to Greta to ask for her thoughts on what she has heard this afternoon from the other panelists, if she has anything new that she would like to add or bring in now.
Thanks very much for that, Carmel. And I mean, some very interesting discussions, and especially with what you hear that's happening in the region. I'm particularly interested with what Richard has said, because I should say to Richard that in updating and reviewing our code, which is being sectionalized, the nonprofits and the MSME, etc., the one we're working on right now, we drew a lot on the King Code, the King Report, the latest King Report. And I mean, we think that you guys did some fantastic work down there. As a matter of fact, I just signed a letter yesterday coming down there to you all, because the issue of looking at your codes and actually using generic terminologies, I thought was very significant. And I think that will actually add a lot of value also. But we have learned a lot, I can tell you, from South Africa in just reviewing and the things that you have implemented. And of course, we have looked at UK and we have looked at the developed countries. But I think one thing that is very clear to us here is that though we may all be far away, we're still all the same. So that we're all at different stages of development, definitely. And where South Africa has reached, when I hear, that the judge is referring to the code, I'm saying, wow, I want that to happen in Jamaica. When will that happen here? But it's so important that we all recognize that we all have a role to play in governance. And that governance is really just not about ticking the boxes. It's really about how we do the things that we do, right? How we generate our profits. It's always, always, always about the how. And I think for me, what is important is that Jamaica has a lot that we can share with the rest of the region. But I can tell you, it takes a lot of willpower. It takes a lot of willpower and pressure from the private sector to get things done. And you're going to have to get to a tipping point where you're really going to say, no more, no more. What is it that we need to actually do? So I think we have a lot to share with each other. I think we have a lot that we can learn also from each other. But I also like to say that together we can achieve much more. And I really have a lot of disappointment with the number of hours and trips and hotels that we spent developing this CARICOM code, which is sitting somewhere in CARICOM, in the CARICOM Secretariat. Nothing has happened with it, because that was actually going to be the framework from which every country would now develop their own code. And lots of money was spent. I think it was IDB who provided a lot of funding, and nothing has happened. So I want to thank the other persons in terms of their own contribution. I think the US is actually a very interesting case, because being all, majority of us are really have been on the monarch system. So our governance structures, like South Africa, etc., are all the same. In the US, it's really a little different. But we are very interested in, and we follow very closely what happens, because as we like to say in Jamaica, when the US sneeze, we catch cold down here. So whatever happens in your business environment also impacts on us. And I like to say to directors when I'm training them in particular, and you know, when we talk about disclosure of your CEO's salary, and that now being having to be voted on, you know, everybody, so well, that won't reach Jamaica, but we believe that things like that will get here because we work so closely with the US, and we do find that a number of US entities are also investing in Jamaica. So there are lots of things that are happening there that we do believe also will impact on us. But what should be very clear from what Kamala has been doing over the past 2 days is that we have work to do, but if we do it collectively, we can make change and we can make a difference.
Well, thank you so much, Greta, for that. Unfortunately, we are actually a little bit over time, so we do not have the opportunity to go into any questions now. But thank you to the entire panel. It was a very stimulating discussion, and it really shows some of us in the Caribbean how much further we have to go to really be able to promote good governance within our public sector organizations. So now I'm going to turn back over to Kamala and have her close this session. Thank you again, everybody.
Thank you, Carmel.
Thank you very much, Camille. And thank you also to John and to Liz and to Richard Foster. This was really a very good session, but I have to say a very, very, very special thank you to Greta. Greta will tell you I held on to her coattails and insisted we had to have this presentation from Jamaica. Initially, we were trying to get the minister himself, but of course, that proved a little difficult. But I'm so grateful, Greta, that you did put aside what your other schedules were to make time for us today. You know, there's so much that we could learn from this Jamaican experience, but I wanted to add to it by saying, you know, what you have shared and the approach that Jamaica has taken to a lot of things is why we were able to see Jamaica Stock Exchange, you know, be voted the top performing stock exchange in the world for 2 consecutive years. A small nation coming out of the Caribbean region, because Jamaicans have demonstrated that, yes, there are challenges, but they're willing to really tackle things head on. And I really admire the kind of governance structures that you have put in place. I admire the quality of people I have been interacting with out of Jamaica since assuming this responsibility as CEO of the Caribbean Corporate Governance Institute. And I think that you guys are really good leaders. You have paved the way for a lot of us in terms of what we can do. But Greta, I also want to say you've ended on just the right note with your closing remarks. In that, as we look at the discussions over the last 2 days, there's a clear demonstration of how much we can learn from each other so that we will be able to move forward rather than feel that you are spinning, you know, and taking years to be able to achieve things. And to ensure that our conference doesn't just turn out to be a talk shop, you know, we want to ensure that we have that group that is moving forward, who are going to really see how we can engage many of these issues and help make things happen effectively.